Hello again. Welcome back to the course Life of Christ. Now we're in class 52, and we want to talk about the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas and Annas. The first thing I'd like to do is to show you some of the background geographically for where this probably took place. What you're looking at right now is another one of our 360 videos, and we actually start out to the side of the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. This is over again in the southwestern part of Jerusalem, near where Jesus would have had the Last Supper with his disciples. And what you're looking at here is a kind of a terrace that's on the southern part of this property. And you're looking down here into the Hinnom Valley. Remember that? The Hinnom Valley, this is where Judas would come later to hang himself. And then if you look on around this direction, then you see the city of David over this area here. Then you see the Mount of Olives right through here, okay? And then you see the Golden Dome where it's on the Temple Mount there. And then part of the old city as well. Then what you have right around this area, you can't really see the church here, but this is the area of the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. And I want you to notice how far this is. This gives you part of a perspective from the Mount of Olives, where the Garden of Gethsemane is right about here. This is, they began over here, remember by the Last Supper, Jesus with his disciples walked all the way through the city, all the way over to there, and then we're taken all the way back over to here. And that's just part of the visual on how far that is. Here's the terrace I mentioned there, group from Argentina. Looking at that, and then again back to the Hinnom Valley in this area. Now, if we scoot down on into the next part of this, we have we're on another terrace near the church, and we begin looking at a statue, a sculpture that was done about Peter's denials, because again, this church is even called St. Peter's in Gallicantu, St. Peter's where the cock crowed. So how would you like to have a church named after your worst moment in your life, and then all the tourists come and remember it? That's part of what this is about. But this is a striking statue. Peter's here, and he's defending himself against the accusations of the three who call him and say, you must be one of his disciples. And again, a perspective here. You see how far it is from this place near the Last Supper in Caiaphas' house all the way over to the Mount of Olives and then the old city here. So you look around, here is the terrace that's just outside the church, and then you see the beginnings of these steps here that are the holy stairs that Jesus went down. We saw the picture of earlier. And then up on this wall up here, was where, in fact, you actually see part of the mural that we saw in the painting there. And then if you look around this direction, you see the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. And we'll look at more pictures of this, but this is kind of how it's all tied together in this video. Okay, so that's outside the church on the terrace. Now, if we go a little bit further down, then we're now down inside a dungeon, and if we look, first of all, we're standing in the bottom of the dungeon, and we are looking up through two windows that were made later on. This used to be a cistern, and they would put the prisoners down in it when they were waiting for their trials or waiting to be convicted and sentenced. You see over here, there's a window where the guards would look down and check on the prisoners. You see up here, you're looking straight up now into a little hole. That's what they would use to lower the prisoners into the dungeon. And then you look back down, now you're back down on the lower level. Pretty dark place even today. The stairs that lead down to the dungeon. And then we're actually standing in front of a pulpit in the corner of the dungeon. And there's bloodstains even on the walls still of this dungeon. And this Bible is opened to Psalm 87 and 88 and talking about calling to God from the pit. This is one of the places where it's possible, even likely, that Jesus was during at some point of the trial with Caiaphas. Okay. Then let's go on through here. Okay, yeah, so there's that. Now let's jump back over to the PowerPoint. Let's look at some of these pictures now where you can get a little bit better view. Just wanted to show the video to help you connect it all there. This is the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, and on top of the church you have a cock crowing, reminding everybody of Peter's sin there. Embarrassing for Peter. On the doors of the church you have part of the scene from this time, Jesus and his disciples carved into the doors. And then here is that statue, the sculpture that I mentioned earlier. I don't even know him. Okay, it's had one of the soldiers asking Peter, here's Peter, and then the two ladies that were the servants asking him as well. If you go inside the church, upstairs there's a chapel, and on the walls of the church you have the 14 stations of the cross, the death of Christ, that the Catholics use to celebrate. It's interesting to look around those mosaics that highlight different moments of Jesus' trip to the cross. And then here are some pictures from the dungeon again. The two windows there, the hole in the ceiling that they let him down into the pit, and then again the soldier's window right here. Now if you go through this window, if you could do that and then go to the right, this is what you would see. This is the whipping area. And again, it's part of this whole dungeon complex under the church. And this whole dungeon area and the pit and the cemetery outside and some mikvahs where people would purify themselves all were part of what they think was the court complex around the high priest house back in the time of Jesus. So that's one of the reasons why they think this was Caiaphas' house where Jesus came that night. And what they would do here is they would tie the prisoners to like these pillars, for example. Obviously this little wall was not here. And they would tie their hands and their feet to the pillars and whip them without any clothes on most of the time. And then down here in the rock, you can't see it really well, but there's little depressions that have either vinegar or salt water there, and every so often they'd take some of that and throw it on the back of the prisoners just to make them suffer more. This whole area down here is really somber and quiet. The sound echoes, and you can just imagine the screams of the prisoners as they suffered here. If you're in the pit and you're listening to someone being whipped, again, you're thinking about what might happen. Our guide said that it's possible even that Jesus may have spent a night here, because the usual tradition was for the prisoner to come to trial, to spend the night, to wait maybe for the verdict, and then go to the next day. And it's possible even that Jesus may have been whipped here as well as in the house of Pilate, depending on how you take the chronology of events in the last week. So again, a very sobering place that underlines how much Jesus suffered this night, even before he got to Pilate's house or before he got to the cross. Now let's go to the text, and we're going to start in John 18. And John is the only one that mentions Jesus before Annas. And so let's read beginning in verse 12, 12b. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Now, we don't know exactly why he was brought to Annas first, because he was not the high priest, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest. If you skip on down to verse 19, it says, "Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. 'I have spoken openly to the world,' Jesus replied. 'I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said.' When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. 'Is this the way you answer the high priest?' he demanded. 'If I said something wrong,' Jesus replied, 'testify as to what was wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?' Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest." Now, there's a possibility that verse 24 is out of order, that perhaps verse 24 belongs back up underneath verse 14, perhaps even after 13, where he's before Annas, and Annas questions him, and then he sends him bound to Caiaphas, and then everything after that from 14 on is actually in Caiaphas's house, because it mentions that next in verse 19 the high priest is questioning Jesus, and we know that's Caiaphas at the time. It's a small detail, but it's worth mentioning. And then we have the trial actually before Caiaphas. So let's jump back over to Matthew's account and read it, beginning in verse 57. Matthew 26:57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, although many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" Now, that's a sad story, because we know who Jesus is, and we know that they're treating him very unjustly. And in fact, someone has done a study of Jesus' trial in comparison to the Jewish laws that govern trials and how they should be conducted. And they found a number of illegal aspects about Jesus' trial. First of all, in verse 59, obviously there's false evidence brought. They can't even agree on the witnesses and what they're going to say. You're supposed to have at least 2 to 3 witnesses that support the charges. And if you don't, you're supposed to not have the trial. And we see that they couldn't find anyone to agree on what the charges or the evidence were, but they finally drum up enough to move forward. Second, it's illegal to have a night trial. You're supposed to have it during the day, and especially so people can be there, can be done transparently, and this was at night. Third, you have verse 61 that talk about what the witnesses said, that he said, "I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." That's kind of a bad quote from John 2:19. It's badly quoted there, and so it's not exactly accurate. Next, supposedly you're not supposed to pronounce the verdict the same day as the evidence is heard. You're supposed to wait at least until the next day for people to consider the evidence, and yet they go right ahead and rush to a verdict here. Then in verse 63, to me, this is the most striking thing out of all of it, because the high priest is kind of goading Jesus on to answer. And the interesting thing is that he doesn't have to answer. According to Jewish law, he can, in some ways, take the fifth, not say anything that would condemn himself, and if they can't produce enough evidence to convict him, he's supposed to be set free. And so if he doesn't say anything here, then legally they can't keep him and he has to be set free. But he decides to speak up and remove all doubt as to who he is, and so he condemns himself to death by speaking up, because then he's now given them evidence, solid evidence that everyone has heard. Now there's no problem of witnesses. Now the whole council is a witness to what he's saying, and they believe he's spoken blasphemy, which is the charge, and that is worthy of death, because he's saying that he is the Son of Man. He's saying that he's God. And so he condemns himself to death, even though he didn't have to say a single word. That's the most amazing thing about it, that it actually was the truth. He didn't have to say it, but it was the truth. They took it as blasphemy, and then they sentenced him to death. Okay? Now, at the same time this is happening, let's jump over to Luke's version of Peter's denial of Jesus in Luke chapter 22, going to verse 56 through 62. So it says, well, let's go back to 55. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. And so we see that Jesus' trial and Peter's denials are happening at the same time, concurrently. And it looks as though, from Luke's version, that they're in a place where they can see each other somehow. Maybe Peter is outside in the courtyard, and there's a window that gives onto the chamber where Jesus is, and Jesus can kind of know what's going on out there, and Peter can kind of know what's going on inside. And because it says the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, and that reminds Peter what's happening. And it's interesting that at the same time, Peter is trying to save his life, and he's losing it in a sense. Remember that phrase of Jesus? And Jesus is trying to lose his life. He's condemning himself to death, and he's saving everybody else's life at the same time. The same saying of Jesus is taking place in both of them. And then if you remember this look, you wonder what kind of look it was. Some people think maybe Jesus was disgusted, or maybe he was angry, or maybe scornful, but I don't think so. I think that he knew Peter would do it. I think he was totally sad about it, but I think this look was more of a sad kind of love, and maybe a reminder to Peter, I said this, I knew this would happen, but I still love you. And that just was terrible for Peter to take. And it says then he went outside and wept bitterly. So Peter denies Jesus publicly 3 times. And this is a man that he's been with publicly for 3 years. In fact, he's the leader of Jesus's apostles. And many people know that Jesus and Peter have been together. He said he didn't even know him. And you think about this in the context of what we said about rabbis with smicha, with authority, and their followers, their talmidim. It would have been obvious to thousands of people in Israel that Peter was a disciple, an apostle of Jesus. And so when a disciple of a rabbi in this way, after 3 years, denies his rabbi, there's no rabbi in the country that would let him continue to be a disciple. He may not hate him, he may not try to accuse him, but he would certainly say, "You can't be my disciple anymore." And so Peter probably thinks that's what's happened, that even though Jesus still loved him, that he no longer had a part in the kingdom of God, in Jesus' mission. And I think that's part of the reason why he wept bitterly, what he's losing, and mostly because he had betrayed his friend and his rabbi. And so he goes out and he weeps bitterly. And the interesting thing is we don't know what happens after that, because this is, say, like, Thursday night or maybe early Friday morning. And so the rest of Friday, the time when Jesus is crucified, the time when he's put in the tomb, The rest of that night, the Sabbath begins. The next day, Saturday, all day long, Saturday night, all the way to Sunday morning. We don't know where Peter is. We don't know if he went back to the house and met with some of the other disciples or some of the women that had followed Jesus. We don't know if he was watching Jesus from a distance on the cross. We just don't know. He may have considered running back to Galilee and cutting all ties. But we know that on Sunday morning he was around to run to the tomb and check out the tomb with John. We know that he's back there. And then after the resurrection and after Jesus, sees the disciples, we know he's there. But then evidently at some time, maybe several days pass before they're back in Galilee and Jesus meets with Peter in John 21. And so again, all of that time you wonder, what's Peter thinking? He's with the disciples, and yet he's got to be wondering, has Jesus decided to cut ties with him? The next time that he sees him, he's going to say, Peter, I know that you're still here in the group, but actually you're not part of this group anymore. And so in John 21, when that comes around, and he has this private conversation with Jesus, and Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me? It stings, but Peter probably knows that he deserves it. And then finally, Jesus gives him back his commission. He affirms his love for him, and he affirms that he still believes in him, which is extremely rare for a rabbi to do. And I think that if you look at that, he's saying, Peter, I not only believe that you can do this mission, but I also believe you can still be like me as one of my disciples. And if you look at that scene, that's part of what makes me believe that Jesus would have taken Judas back too. And what makes me believe that Jesus takes us back too when we mess up. This scene in John 21. And so after this, then the Sanhedrin, in just a really short verse, one verse in Matthew 27, condemns Jesus to die. And then once that happens and Judas realizes what has happened, that's when he takes the money and goes back and throws the money back in the temple. And then he goes and kills himself. And so if you look at that, let's go on to Matthew 27 and read verses 3 through 10. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it's blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That's why it's been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. And so you have this area that is right in that Hinnom Valley that we've seen before in an earlier class, and that we saw in the video earlier on in this class, that Hinnom Valley. This is a monastery that has kind of been built there to remember Judas' death. We don't know exactly where he was in Hinnom Valley when he hung himself, and Peter mentions in Acts 1 that he probably swelled up and his body burst, and all of his insides fell out. Peter mentions that detail in Acts 1. But this is the place where people remember that. And so it's interesting to compare geographically what happened in this place with Judas, and then later on in Acts 2 with the people, because it happens in about the same area. Judas runs out of the temple after he's given the coins back. He probably runs down the southern steps, just there to the south, and runs into the Hinnom Valley where he hangs himself. He ran out of the temple to his death. But then on Pentecost in Acts 2, when people are coming to the temple to worship, they're coming up from the southern part of the city. They're coming up through the city of David. They're coming up maybe near the Hinnom Valley. They're coming up the southern steps that Judas ran down, and they're hearing the message that Peter and the apostles preach on Acts 2. And then right there near the southern steps, most likely, is when 3,000 people accept Jesus and they're baptized right there. So in the same place where Judas runs out to his death, the people come up the valley and they come to life. So an interesting combination there of events. And so now we have Jesus' trial before Caiaphas has been fulfilled, and he's about to be sent over to Pilate, where he'll be sentenced to death and scourged. So we'll see you next class.